The Smithsonian Institution, America's complex of museums, education, and research centers, designed to preserve the country's history, has been accused of hiding some of that history, including Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon and the bones of ancient giants. Even a U.S. congressman recently said that he believes giants were real and hinted he might use his seat on oversight to investigate. Since the 1990s, the idea that the Smithsonian has conducted a diabolical cover-up has grown in popularity in some circles. What are the facts of this matter? We're going to take a close look right now. Maybe you've heard of Eric Burleson. He's a congressman from Missouri, one of the rank-and-file members on the House Oversight Committee. In late June 2025, while away from his desk, he was a featured presenter at NEFCON 2025 in Bozeman, Montana, a conference devoted to discussion about the Nephilim, those giant beings from biblical lore, sharing the stage with UFO and cryptid promoters. Around the same time, Burleson sat down on Blaze TV with Alex Stein. There, he admitted he believed giants were real.
Were giants ever real, in your opinion, Rep? I hope this doesn't get you canceled.
No, I'm going to say I do believe that they were real.
Thank you. Yes, this is a real guy. This is a real man. Because there's no way, it's, especially all the pyramids and all this stuff, there's definitely some bigger human beings. I think we are kind of the offspring of that. Wow, Rep, you're so based in reality.
Actually, I'm going to a conference tomorrow, this weekend, that's called NEFCON. It's being hosted by a guy named Tim Alvarino, friends from back home that told me, you got to listen to his podcast because he has a very different perspective. I listened to it and it was a rabbit hole that I ended up listening to the entire...
Wait, time out. How deep down the rabbit hole did you go? Did you get to the part where the Smithsonian's hiding the bones? Did you get to that part of the rabbit hole yet?
Yes.
Yeah. And isn't it weird though?
And guess what?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm on oversight, so we have oversight over the Smithsonian.
Well, let's go in there and look. I'll help you guys. I'll bring the flashlights. I'll probably accidentally break something. Let somebody, actually, don't let me touch it because I'll mess something up. But at the end of Indiana Jones, and I believe this, could call me crazy, there's more truth in the movies than there is, there's truth in the movies, lies in the news. I almost believe movies are more real than the news. I know that even that sounds kind of crazy, but they tell us a lot of stuff in movies. Kind of predictive programming is what they call it. And in Indiana Jones, well, I'm just saying, in Indiana Jones, they're fighting for the most important thing. What is it again? What is they're fighting for?
Ark of the Covenant.
Ark of the Covenant, duh. And then at the end of the movie, they get the Ark of the Covenant, and what do? They put it in a little crappy wooden box and under a pile of a bunch of junk. They don't even know what it is. So it's like there's stuff in the Smithsonian that paints and tells a picture, tells a story that they don't want us to know. So, Rep, are you seriously going to investigate the Smithsonian? I'm pumped up. This is like good news. This is music to my ears, sir.
We've got to figure out a strategy behind that, so I'll be happy to work with you on that.
Please, I will go after him. Like I said, I'll live in there. Night at the Museum is my favorite movie. I don't mind hanging out with Robin Williams.
Actually, there is an investigation of the Smithsonian coming, but not the one Burleson was angling for. On August 12, 2025, the White House sent a formal letter ordering a sweeping internal review of Smithsonian exhibitions and materials, with a 120-day timeline to propose content corrections and purge what it calls divisive, ideologically driven language. In other words, from the point of view of the Trump administration, the Smithsonian is too woke. Within days, President Trump amplified the message, calling the Smithsonian out of control for focusing on how bad slavery was. At the time of the release of this video, we are still in that 120-day period, but the political heat aimed at America's national museums isn't because of what the Smithsonian is hiding. According to President Trump, it's because the Smithsonian is saying too much. Nevertheless, some people, no doubt, are hoping that this investigation may turn up something about evidence that is allegedly being hid. The Smithsonian Institution was created by the U.S. Congress in 1846, funded by the bequest of an English scientist, James Smithson, to pursue, quote, the increase and diffusion of knowledge, unquote, and it has been central to American archaeology from the beginning. Its very first major publication in 1848 was Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis's Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, the first systematic survey of earthworks in the United States. Then in 1879, Congress created the Bureau of American Ethnology under John Wesley Powell, headquartered at the Smithsonian. One of its missions was to study the mounds that dotted the American Midwest and South. These Native American mounds, by the way, are the source of most of the bones that fueled the stories about giants. The Bureau's most notable project in the 1800s was Cyrus Thomas's Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. For generations, people had speculated that the mounds were built by some mysterious lost race, sometimes imagined as giants. But Thomas's conclusion was that the evidence tied the mounds to the ancestors of Native American tribes. In his own words,
"The historical evidence is clear and undisputed that when the region in which the mounds appear was discovered by Europeans, it was inhabited by Indians only. There is no historical or other evidence that any other race or people than the Indians ever occupied this region, or any part of it, previous to its discovery by Europeans at the close of the 15th century. The importance and bearing of this evidence does not stop with what has been stated, for it is so interlocked with other facts relating to the works of the veritable mound builders as to leave no hiatus into which the theory of a lost race or Toltec occupation can possibly be thrust. It forms an unbroken chain connecting the mound builders and historical Indians, which no sophistry or reasoning can break. Not only are these graves found in mounds of considerable size, but they are also connected with one of the most noted groups in the United States."
The Smithsonian point of view from then until now, along with that of archaeologists of America, even those not associated with the Smithsonian, is that native peoples built the mounds, not a lost race. Today, the Smithsonian is a sprawling trust of 21 museums, the National Zoo, and research centers that house about 155 million objects. The system is overseen by Lonnie G. Bunch III, the 14th Secretary, a historian whose job is to keep this big machine honest, relevant, and true to its charter. Its size is probably one of the reasons why it attracts conspiracy theories. But you might wonder, if the Smithsonian came out and said, way back then, that there is no evidence for a lost race or of giants, isn't it possible that since that time when they have encountered such evidence, they might be motivated to sweep it under the carpet? To answer this, we need to delve deeper.
My old desk chair. Yeah, you know where I got this piece of garbage? In the garbage. Yeah, I was outside walking the dog, I saw it on the curb, and I thought, oh, I need a new desk chair, and I don't have any money to buy a new one, so I rolled this thing about a block away, this was, all the way home. Yeah, I've been using it for the last 9 years. It was a little low, okay, and I couldn't adjust it. So I got this nice cushion. It also was a little hard, so I needed this. I sit in this thing like 6 to 8 hours a day. Well, why have I been using it for so long and it's so bad? But it took a company reaching out to me, Flexispot, and they said, hey, do you want a desk chair? I'm like, I need a desk chair. Yeah, so goodbye, old chair. And hello, new chair. It's got memory foam here. It has both support for the lumbar and the sacrum down here. You can adjust the seat depth out or in. You can adjust the headrest height, tilt here, or this way. You can adjust the backrest height up or down. Armrest can be adjusted for gaming, typing, whatever. And all kinds of different postures for however you like to sit. Satisfaction is guaranteed on this. You're allowed to have a 30-day trial of the chair. They'll send it to you. If you don't like it, you can send it back. 30 days. If you like this one, the C7, you can use my code C730 on checkout and get $30 off. I'll put all the info below the video. Or if you want to upgrade from this, there's the C7 Morpher, which is even better.
Where do the stories about evidence of giants come from? They don't come from the Smithsonian, and they don't come from archaeologists. They don't come from paleontologists. They come from the media. And back in the 1800s and early 1900s, that meant the newspapers. The most famous case, and the one that appears to have started the giant craze, is the Cardiff giant of 1869. 2 well diggers in New York apparently uncovered a 10-foot petrified man. Crowds paid to see it. Even some clergy vouched for it. But it turned out to be a hoax. A New York skeptic by the name of George Hall had quarried a gypsum block, hired sculptors in Chicago to shape it, secretly buried the figure on his cousin's farm, and let the press do the rest. P.T. Barnum upped the ante by exhibiting his own rival giant across town, a copy of the fake. Eventually, academics exposed it, and Hall confessed. Why did he do it? He said he wanted to show how credulous people are. A few years later, he did it again. In 1877, he helped stage the Solid Muldoon in Colorado, a 7-ish-foot missing link molded from mortar, clay, rock dust, and by one account, ground bone and meat. Planted for a discovery, toured for profit, and again unmasked. But even though these were revealed as hoaxes, and there will be more to come, what it also showed is that people ate this kind of stuff up. And the newspapers started printing supposed giant discoveries all the time. Giant enthusiasts today have spent a lot of time collecting these stories. For them, it constitutes evidence for the existence of giants. You can find these stories in books like, I got a couple, Giants on Record by Jim Vieira and Hugh Newman, The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America, The Missing Skeletons, and The Great Smithsonian Cover-up by Richard Dewhurst, and several others. Here's a part of a presentation given by Hugh Newman on the subject when his book was released.
The fact that there's this many that we've uncovered just ourselves is probably just the icing on the cake. And the fact that it's been covered up so carefully and so meticulously by the Smithsonian Institution, it really does raise a lot of uncomfortable questions when we try and talk to them about this. I mean, I've actually been to the Smithsonian and tried to ask them about it, and they're like, huh? Giants? You mad? And yet we know that they received at least 500 different bones and skeletons just through the accounts that we've uncovered. Where are they now then? They've disappeared.
This map is based on a list compiled in Newman's book, Giants on Record. It has 208 sites listed in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. They're discussed in the book, the vast majority taken from newspaper articles. He claims that 500 different bones and skeletons were sent to the Smithsonian. There are 206 bones in a human skeleton, so I'm not sure what he's counting exactly, but if he's suggesting that the majority of reports say that giant bones were sent to the Smithsonian, my research says otherwise. In fact, the vast majority of the giant reports in his book, in other books too, and on giant researcher websites, and in my own research, don't even mention the Smithsonian. What Newman is doing by showing his audience this map is to emphasize the large number of places for which there are reports of large skeletons. And this is one of the main arguments of the giant believers, that there are so many reports, they could not all possibly be wrong.
It's hard to know what's true because there's over 1,000 reports in newspapers of these findings. But the mainstream narrative is it was giants were cool at the time, it was hoaxes, and it was just to make money. But it's just too many coincidences.
The huge number of reports is the equivalent of a Gish gallop, a rhetorical tactic that prioritizes quantity over quality. Giant believers don't sift through the reports, fact-checking them, and then only share what can be verified. Instead, they compile anything and everything that might support their position without regard for accuracy. A huge number of the cases listed has no height given for the giants at all, just a vague descriptor that they were tall. Of course, the problem here is that this strategy has a negative impact on the cover-up claim, because the more you try to strengthen the probability of giants by multiplying the instances, the more you weaken the probability of a cover-up, as it would become increasingly difficult for any institution to get rid of the evidence. For there to have been a cover-up, agents of the Smithsonian would need to have gone out and purchased, stolen, or destroyed every single one of the hundreds of giant bones on the list. How much would such an undertaking have cost? Interestingly, 14 of the cases in the list were reported in Smithsonian records. Wait, some of them were reported in the Smithsonian's own records, you say? Yeah. Vieira and Newman found a few instances within the Smithsonian's annual reports in which they themselves apparently admitted that giants were found. Granted, they don't say giants, Most of these instances consist of reports that a large skeleton was found, and the height of the skeleton is not given. Now, if you ran into any archaeological report today that referred to a large human skeleton, you would not infer that this meant a giant. But Newman and Vera do. There are several reports included where the length of the skeletons are given, and if we take the Smithsonian's 19th century field reports at face value, assuming that the length of the skeleton equals the height, there are a number of burials where the excavator casually writes something like, the skeleton was 7 feet long, or even 7.5 feet. Let's think about that. If they were trying to get rid of the evidence, why would they include these accounts in their own annual reporting and publish them? I thought they were trying to hide them. This highlights a conflict between evidence of giants and evidence of cover-up. But one of the most interesting aspects of the list compiled by Vieira and Newman, and of the reports of giants in general, is that most of the ones with measurements, at least 90%, are within the 7-foot to 8-foot range. Is there something significant about this size range? Does it indicate an average size for a race? Strangely, the population biology data we now have from thousands of measured skeletons shows the skeletons in the normal height range. What's going on? Now, A.J. Gentile, whom you heard from a few minutes ago, is under the impression that the mainstream answer to all these cases is that they were either hoaxes or attempts to make money. But that is not so. Mind you, there are plenty that were hoaxes, but the vast majority of these measurements are probably real. No, the answer to most of these reports is not that they were hoaxes. It's something else entirely. The measurements given in the reports are commonly in situ measurements, just taking a measure of the skeleton laying in the ground as it was found with a ruler. Or they might measure some bones and add up the lengths. Or they might make an amateurish, extrapolated measurement based on a single bone someone found. In many Smithsonian reports, field assistants or local diggers made the notes. These are not scientific measurements. It has long been recognized that the stature, height, of an individual when alive cannot be ascertained by simply measuring the length of the person's skeleton. Field head-to-toe measures in a burial don't give you the real height. Why can't you just measure the skeleton? For one, some burials were placed in extended positions with padding, lining, or grave goods that created extra space, and when soil fills in around these voids, bones may be found spread farther apart than they were in life. We also have the issue of taphonomic distortion. Burials in mound contexts are often disturbed by soil pressure, water, or collapse of the burial pit. Bones shift apart at the joints, for example. The head slides back from the spine, the pelvis tilts away from the femurs, the ankle bones separate from the tibia. When an untrained observer lays a tape across this stretched out arrangement, the skeleton looks much longer than it really was in life. This effect alone can add to the apparent stature. Most giant reports trace back to these kinds of mismeasurement I've just described. And I should add that 19th century field notes often add an element of the sensational. Saying a skeleton of unusual size over 7 feet made a report seem more significant. By the early 20th century, as physical anthropology professionalized, such casual estimates mostly disappeared from Smithsonian publications. Let me give you an example to illustrate why these newspaper reports cannot be credulously accepted as gospel truth.
George Arnold, a farmhand in the employ of Franklin Boots, who lives about 15 miles west of this city, made a discovery which has excited widespread interest in this county. The object of this interest is the skeleton of what was once a man of gigantic proportions, which was uncovered in a gravel pit on Mr. Boots's farm. The skeleton was found in a sitting posture, facing the east, and about 6 feet beneath the surface. Some of the bones were badly broken by a caving of the bank, but the skull and some of the larger bones were taken out intact, and from them may be easily realized the gigantic stature of the being to whom they once gave support. A measurement of the skull from front to rear, the rule passing through the eye socket to the back of the head, shows it to have been about 16 inches, while the breadth of the inferior maxillary was 8 1/2 inches, showing that the brain must have weighed from 4 1/2 to 5 pounds. Careful measurements of the other bones establish the fact that the man, when alive, was not less than 9 feet in height and large in proportion. From the appearance of the teeth, which are very large and do not show the slightest sign of decay, although they are worn down to almost the bones of the jaw, the man could not have been less than 100 years old when he died, and of course he may have been much older.
The bones of the lower jaw are very large and thick, showing an extent of muscular development in that organ which is far beyond anything of the present day. How long ago the body of this giant was interred where it was unearthed, or to what tribe or nation he belonged when he trod the earth, in all the majesty of his strength, it is impossible to say, but it must have been ages ago, as all the indications show that the soil where the remains were discovered had not been disturbed for many generations. Steps have been made to have casts made of the bones, and they will be placed either in the state collection or some of our college museums. So look at this. We have a report of a skeleton that was carefully measured and found to be not less than 9 feet in height. There doesn't seem to be any reason to doubt this report. But a week later, there was a follow-up article. Dr. Collette, the state geologist who spent 2 days and several dollars trying to find the giant skeleton, which it was reported had been unearthed near Shelbyville, yesterday received a letter from Dr. M.M. Adams of Greenfield in relation to the matter. There seems to have been some mistake in the geographical location of the alleged monstrosity, which it is now claimed is in the possession of R.J. Strickland, editor of the Greenfield Jeffersonian. Dr. Adams, at the request of Dr. Collette, investigated the matter, and in a letter received from him yesterday, he says, "There are a few fragments of a skeleton found in a gravel pit on Mr. Boots's farm, but not of a giant by any means. The size of the cranium was not larger than the average of the modern Indian, nor do the fragments indicate that the person was above 5 feet 8 inches in height. The whole thing is a giant fraud and an imposition on the credulity of the people." As you can see, unscientific measurement to ascertain the height of an individual can be way off. There are 2 other things we can glean from this series of events. 1, newspapers of the time were more than happy to print hearsay, and they often could get the facts very wrong. And 2, although these yarns were spread by newspapers, at least some of the newspapers ended up retracting the story. They put the debunking on the last page of the paper, whereas the original story was on page 1. But I have to ask, what if we only had the first article? What if the retraction was never printed? It would have ended up in Newman and Vieira's book. These old newspapers illustrate how rumors work. Some guy digs up something in his yard or digs into a native burial mound, finds what he thinks are giant bones. Someone takes a rough measurement and maybe exaggerates a bit. A newspaper editor fills a slow news day with a fantastic tale. Other outlets copy the story with less context. Trained examiners check the bones and find ordinary humans or misidentified animal remains. Sometimes a sober correction follows in the paper, but often readers miss the quiet retraction. To be fair, retractions usually don't come at all. Why bother? Giants were all the craze in those days, and newspapers were all about it. The science of forensic anthropology has progressed a long way since those early days. But even back then, they knew that simply measuring the height of a skeleton wasn't going to result in an accurate estimation of height. The scientific way of doing it then was to measure the bones individually. But for that, you would need all or most of the bones. In the early 20th century, Smithsonian anthropologist Ales Hrdlicka fielded giant claims regularly, and in an interview explained why giant measurements were routine anatomical misreads.
Reports of bones of a prehistoric race of human giants, accompanied by strong statements and assumed proofs, continue to be received by the Smithsonian Institution at a usual rate of 2 or 3 a month. Many of them are traced as far as feasible, and a common set of fallacies is found which fits nearly all of the reports. Dr. Ales Hrdlicka, curator of physical anthropology, explains how the mistakes are made.
"First,"
says Dr. Hrdlicka,
"all of these reports are astonishingly alike. They all describe an ancient race whose individuals were between 7 and 8 feet tall, and who had bones and jaws considerably larger and heavier than those of men living today. The estimate of stature usually is based on the thigh bones of a man of ordinary size. But the person unfamiliar with human anatomy does not know that the upper joint of the femur is several inches higher in the sacral region than would appear from superficial examination of the living body. The finder makes a hurried comparison of the length of the fossil thigh bone with his own, applying the specimen usually to the front of his body, and from this calculates roughly the size of his hypothetical ancient giant. The height usually appears between 7 and 8 feet. The jawbones of the giants almost invariably fit into a series of the jaws of extant peoples. Some may be rather massive, but seldom excessively so. But the first act of the finder is to fit the jawbone over his own. He generally finds that he can do so, and jumps to the conclusion that the owner must have had an abnormally large jaw. Actually, most adult jawbones, unless narrow, can be fitted over those of living persons, to a certain extent at least. Most of the giant bones reported from the United States are human,
though they are remains of persons of ordinary size. In Mexico, however, there are widespread reports of prehistoric gigantes, whose bones lie on inaccessible cerros, mountains. These, where traceable, are generally the bones of large extinct mammals, especially mammoths. Back of it all, Dr. Hrdlicka says, probably is the wish to believe. The idea of an ancient giant race enters, however, into the folklore the world over. Mankind possesses an irrepressible yearning for the marvelous, and is forever seeking evidence to support its imagination. Occasionally, some bone of an abnormal human being is found, or the bones of an animal which is deceptive even to medical men who know human anatomy. The most outstanding recent example occurred a few years ago when Dr. Hrdlicka detected that a supposed newly found skull cap of a, quote, second Pithecanthropus, unquote, in Java was actually the shoulder cap of a fossil elephant, which had been broken off in such a way that the mistake was natural. Next to human giants, Dr. Hrdlicka says, fancy finds its sway with human dwarfs. These specimens prove generally on examination to be the bones of mummies of children. An interesting psychological aspect of these finds is that while the expert is eagerly requested to help in the identification, he is never thanked, but occasionally is even abused for the disillusionment that follows.
Forensic anthropologists today determine stature by measuring long bones, the femur, the tibia, the humerus, and applying regression formulas. It wasn't until the 1950s, actually, that a robust system of stature measurement was developed primarily by Mildred Trotter and Goldine Gleiser, which has been refined over the years. Their regression method examines the relationship between bone length and height, then uses the correlation to create a range for estimated stature. The most accurate regression formulas come from the femur and tibia lengths, because they are the bones that add the most to a person's height. So, equations have been developed for the long bones. Leg bones are more accurate than arm bones, however. And there are different equations for male and female and for ancestral groups. To get an accurate measurement, an osteometric board is used. And if there's a slight difference between two leg bones, they go with the maximum length. Then they just stick the bone measurement into the formulas and get the estimated stature. Here are the formulas that have been developed. For a time, the formulas for Mexican or Asians were used for Native Americans, but these proved to be of insufficient accuracy. In 1967, Santiago Genovese developed formulas for Mesoamericans, and from what I understand, these are the ones used today for indigenous peoples of North America too. So, where did all the giant bones go? Laying aside the hoaxes and just concentrating on the real finds, I will tell you where they went. They didn't disappear. They're still around. Some are even on display, but after being properly measured, they ended up being normal human size. More recently, Jeffrey Wilson, co-founder of the Friends of Serpent Mound and a strong believer in ancient giants, claimed in a 2020 interview that archaeologist Frederick Putnam, who excavated the conical mound near Serpent Mound in the 1880s, uncovered a man at least 8 feet 9 inches tall. It's also worth noting that in his 1890 report, Frederick Putnam described the individual as an adult man nearly 6 feet tall, but Wilson said he estimated the height himself by looking at old photos of the burial and comparing artifacts of known size to the skeleton. To check it, archaeologist Brad Lepper contacted Dr. Michelle Morgan, curator of osteology and paleoanthropology at Harvard's Peabody Museum, the very place where Putnam sent the bones. Morgan measured the bones and replied that the remains were rather large, though not remarkably so, and gave the actual femur lengths, 465 millimeters on the left, 459 on the right. Using those numbers, Lepper and the Ohio History Connections biological anthropologist calculated a height of about 170 centimeters, 5'7" for the dead individual. That falls into the average for Adena men of that period. In fact, a broader study of 24 early woodland males found an average femur length of 463.8 millimeters and an average height of 168 centimeters. So if anything, this individual was just a hair taller than average, but absolutely not 8'9". Wilson's response was only that the measurements taken by Dr. Morgan may not have been the right skeleton. While the conspiracists try to make it seem as if there is evidence the Smithsonian got their grubby little fingers into all these cases of discovery, and there are more instances beside the 4 referenced in Vera and Newman's list, the vast majority of newspaper articles make no mention of the Smithsonian or even archaeologists. Usually such discoveries are mentioned once in the paper, and we never hear about them again, probably because they didn't pan out. The ones that do mention the Smithsonian usually just say, the bones are being sent to the Smithsonian. It was customary back then, if you found some Native American burials, to send it to the Smithsonian. Today, the Smithsonian would tell you not to disturb anything else, and then some archaeologists would show up. I guess they didn't have enough people to go around back then, so they just told you to send over the stuff, all with a complete lack of regard for the sanctity of the burials themselves. But there are some stories in which the Smithsonian plays a greater role. Sometimes, for example, the discoveries were made on digs that the Smithsonian itself was undertaking, or representatives would show up to where someone else had discovered something. I want to look at these instances.
Mr. J.B. Toomer yesterday received a letter from Mr. Hazelton, who was on a visit to Cartersville. The letter contained several beads, made of bone, and gave an interesting account of the opening of a large Indian mound near that town by a committee of scientists sent out from the Smithsonian Institute. After removing the dirt for some distance, a layer of large flagstones was found, which had evidently been dressed by hand and showed that the men who quarried this rock understood their business. These stones were removed when in a kind of vault beneath them, the skeleton of a giant that measured 7 feet 2 inches was found. His hair was coarse and jet black, and hung to the waist, the brow being ornamented with a copper crown. The skeleton was remarkably well preserved and taken from the vault intact. Near the skeleton were found the bodies of several children of various sizes. The remains of the latter were covered with beads made of bone of some kind. Upon removing these, the bodies were found to be enclosed in a network made of straw or reeds, and beneath this was a covering of the skin of some animal. In fact, the bodies had been prepared somewhat after the manner of mummies, and will doubtless throw new light on the history of a people who reared these mounds. Upon the stones that covered the vault were carved inscriptions, and if deciphered, will probably lift the veil that has enshrouded the history of the race of giants that undoubtedly at one time inhabited this continent. All the relics were carefully packed and forwarded to the Smithsonian Institute, and are said to be the most interesting collection ever found in America. The explorers are now at work on another mound in Bartow County, and before their return home will visit various sections of Georgia where antiquities are found. On the Oconee River in Greene County, just above Powell's Mills, are several large mounds, one of them very tall and precipitous. The editor of this paper has now an engagement with Mr. Toon Powell to make an excavation there, and as soon as the weather breaks, we will let our readers know what hidden secrets are contained therein.
The site referred to here is the Etowah Mounds in Cartersville, Georgia, formerly called the Tumlin Mounds, which were created by the Mississippian culture, and which we now know dates to 1000 to 1550, so about 500 to 1,000 years ago. Not Nephilim times. The Smithsonian was most certainly involved in the excavations. In fact, they were leading them, and the excavations are well documented. No race of giants was found there. I haven't been able to corroborate the existence of the skeleton they referred to, but keep in mind that a 7 foot 2 inch tall skeleton, among those of smaller size, is not evidence of a race of giants. And as we already know, skeleton length is not height. That doesn't mean people weren't making claims about this site. A couple of years later, this little snippet was making the rounds.
The water has receded from the Tumlin Mound field, and has left uncovered acres of skulls and bones. Some of these are gigantic. If the whole frame is in proportion to 2 thigh bones that were found, the owners must have stood 14 feet high. Many curious ornaments of shell, brass, and stone have been found. Some of the bodies were buried in small vaults built of stones. A representative of the Smithsonian Institution is investigating the relics.
Apparently in the off-season, some locals found this, and a representative from the Smithsonian came to check it out. Notice here the unscientific extrapolation of height from 2 thigh bones. In this case, it does not say that it was the rep from the Smithsonian or any anthropologist who estimated this height. Had that been the case, the paper most assuredly would have said so to add weight to the claim. No one from the Smithsonian was backing up what the paper was saying. The editor of the local newspaper, the Cartersville American, responded to the claim by writing this.
Something has been said of the marvelous size of skull and jawbone that were found. This, we think, is not so marvelous as the imagination of the man who would create a 14-footer from the remains of a man who is not far from 6 feet.
Here's another case that mentions the Smithsonian, and it is far more interesting.
The corpse of the biggest man that ever lived has been dug up near San Diego, California. At all events, there's no satisfactory record in ancient or modern history of any human being nearly so tall. The mummy, for in such condition the remains were found, is that of a person who must have been 9 feet high in life. This makes allowances for a shrinkage which may be pretty closely calculated. As to the accuracy in the estimate, there can be no question, inasmuch as the cadaver has been carefully inspected and measured by Professor Thomas Wilson, curator of the Department of Prehistoric Anthropology in the Smithsonian Institution, and other scientists.
The tape line, even now, registers the length from heel to top of head at 8 feet 4 inches. Wow, so this is the measurement of a mummy, not a skeleton. So maybe we can rely more on this measurement as reflecting the real height of the person? The mummy is that of an Indian and is almost certainly prehistoric, though its age cannot be determined with any sort of accuracy. Historical records of the part of California where it was found go back for at least 250 years, and they make no mention of any man of gigantic stature. How much older the body may be must be left open to conjecture. Its preservation is no matter for surprise. In that arid region, the atmospheric conditions are such that a corpse buried in the dry season might very well become perfectly desiccated before the arrival of the rains, and thus be rendered permanently proof against decay. The body was found in a cave by a party of prospectors. It is in an excellent state of preservation. The spine is shrunk considerably, being thus reduced in length by reason of the drying of the cartilage between the vertebrae. The knees are somewhat bent. Oh, so it could have been even taller in life. Over the head are the remnants of a leather hood, which seems to have been part of a garment used for the purpose of a shroud. The man was well advanced in years, as is shown by the worn condition of the teeth. It has been stated that the individual must have surpassed in height any giant of whom there is historical record. This is true unquestionably so far as the last 2 centuries are concerned, and accounts of older dates are not at all well authenticated. Indeed, they grow more and more apocryphal as distance of time increases, until they merge into the fabulous stories of antiquity when there was no science or exact knowledge, and nothing was too incredible to be believed. It is a fact that most races of men have entertained a notion to the effect that their own ancestors were giants. This Thomas Wilson that they name was the Smithsonian's curator of prehistoric anthropology in the 1890s. He wrote and lectured on Paleolithic archaeology and stone implements, and his publications are available online. Please note that the article says only that Wilson measured the cadaver to be 8 foot 4, not that he confirmed its authenticity. But yes, a member of the Smithsonian was there to size it all up. In their book, Giants on Record, authors Jim Vieira and Hugh Newman assert that the Smithsonian bought this giant for $500. They based this interpretation on a June 7, 1908 article in the Salt Lake Tribune called Cheats and Hoaxes Recalled by National Gallery Forgeries. They leave out the title of the article and quote only a tiny edited selection. This article, by the way, appeared the day before in the Washington, D.C. Evening Star, but without the photo. The author, John Elfreth Watkins Jr., was the son of John Elfreth Watkins Sr., who had been curator of mechanical technology at the United States National Museum. Let me read to you the entire pertinent section. The mummy of the tallest human giant who ever lived was being barked by a sideshowman at the Atlanta Exposition while a number of these Smithsonian scientists were there. They asked permission to examine it, and when consent was given, applied their tapes and found that it measured 8 feet 4 inches from crown to heel. The giant had been found in a cave near San Diego, California, by a party of prospectors, according to the exhibitor. Over the head were the remains of a leather hood, which appeared to have been part of a shroud. Worn teeth were visible in the mouth, and the outlines of the ribs were plainly seen through the skin. The elongated, emaciated body stood erect in a great narrow coffin, 10 feet long. The exhibitor agreed to sell it for $500 to the Smithsonian, which dispatched Mr. Lucas to the scene. This is Frederick Augustus Lucas, the anatomist and director of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He, Professor W.J. McGee, he was a geologist, anthropologist, and ethnologist, and others made a careful test. A piece of the giant's dried skin was removed, and when tested in the chemical laboratory of the Smithsonian, was found to be gelatin. So it was a fake. But Jim Vieira and Hugh Newman focus on the statement, the exhibitor agreed to sell it for $500 to the Smithsonian, which dispatched Mr. Lucas to the scene with Professor W.J. McGee, for their interpretation. They write, "It is interesting that the director of prehistoric anthropology, Thomas Wilson, and the ethnologist in charge, W.J. McGee, were both involved in this story and were obviously keen to make sure the Smithsonian got it back to their headquarters at an immense cost. $500 in 1895 equates to $14,285 in today's money. But why would they bother doing that if it was simply a sideshow hoax?" The article did not say that the Smithsonian bought the giant. It said that the exhibitor agreed to sell it to the Smithsonian for $500, and then the Smithsonian sent men to check it out. After they found it was gelatin, do Vieira and Newman really think they would have bought it? Surely not. Anyway, we know the fate of the giant. We know, in fact, who it was sold to, and it wasn't the Smithsonian. The story of the sale was documented 3 months later in January 1896. Deputy Marshal Fred Rawson has purchased the gigantic mummy, 8 feet 4 inches in height, found at San Diego last year, and he proposes to travel with it through California as soon as it reaches Berkeley. The mummy is now in Washington, where the previous owners have been for some time trying to sell it to the Smithsonian Institution. The only thing that stood in the way of a sale was the price, and upon this the owners in the institution could not agree. Rawson, who is a professional taxidermist and a lover of curios, watched the progress of the deal, and when he found that there was difficulty, stepped in and purchased the skeleton of the freak. Rawson has a small fortune invested in curiosities and rare specimens from various sections of the globe, and he proposes to put the best of these into a wagon with the bones of the giant and traverse California in real Dime Museum on Wheels style. He expects that the mummy will reach California in May. So, contrary to claims that the Smithsonian bought it, contemporary newspapers show it was purchased by showman Fred Rawson and toured around the country. This is Rawson's version of events anyway. This is not the only time someone tried to sell the Smithsonian a fake. The same article tells us, an alleged ossified woman was brought to Washington some years ago by a man who has paid $500 for it. He submitted it to several scientists of the Smithsonian for examination, among them F.A. Lucas, the well-known anatomist. The ossified lady's jaw was dropped, as in death, and her 2 front teeth were exposed. As soon as Mr. Lucas had focused his critical eye upon these incisors, he pronounced the specimen a fraud. "They are both left teeth," said he. The owner paled a little, but was not satisfied. The scientist told him that an absolute test could be made only by boring into the stony-hearted beauty, and the owner agreed, provided that this could be done without defacement. So her ladyship was turned upon her face, and a drill applied to the crease under her bent knee. The drill was of a tubular sort, and when pulled out, betrayed a generous thickness of cement, below which was a button of the lady's skeleton, which proved to be of gas pipe. I think in both of these cases, the respective owner had purchased these objects from the maker, not knowing they were fakes. Otherwise, why allow the Smithsonian scientists to test them? So they probably were disappointed to find out that they had been had. Thomas Wilson's name comes up again in 1899 in regard to the Miamisburg mounds in Ohio. Excavations began at the site in 1869, 30 years before this, but sometimes the locals would come across remains. The story of a giant first broke in December of 1898. A discovery of the greatest scientific interest was made when the pickaxes of Edward W. Gebhardt and Edward Kaufman of this place, they were local fellas, disturbed the long repose of a skeleton that had been buried for no one can tell how many thousands of years. The body that once proudly strode on earth, possessed of the living strength of a giant, with the bones just found for its framework, was surely not of a race of which history has given us any record. The skeleton is that of a human being, who in life must have been of immense size. The face is almost gorilla-like in its angularity. The jawbones are tremendous, and the teeth have been pronounced by a local dentist, Dr. Harlan, to be as strong and perfect as any he has ever seen. The writer goes on to say that a number of the local doctors have been discussing its significance, and then relates how the body was found. He concludes, "At present the bones are an exhibition here. They are serving as a star attraction, for the people are very proud of the fact that once in this neighborhood there lived a race of prehistoric giants who erected the largest earth mound in the country, and then disappeared, leaving behind them fragments of stone, pieces of pottery, and woven cloth made of bark, to show that they once were owners of the valley." Interesting. So it seems Gebhardt and Kaufman were making a bit of money from their find. Before the internet, this is how the American rumor machine worked. If a farmer, miner, or road crew hit something odd, within days a headline might declare, "Giant skeleton unearthed." Then a tent went up, and for a small fee you could see the wonder yourself. How long this was ago, where the mound builders originally came from, what they looked like, whether or not they will be proven someday to have been the long-looked-for link between man and the lower animals, are questions that the residents of this locality would like above all things to have some scientists decide. The discovery of the skeleton with its peculiar-shaped skull will prove of great service to the investigation so far as it concerns the appearance of the mound builders. The whole question of man's first appearance on Earth is being fiercely discussed since the skeleton was found. Compared with how the story develops over the next several weeks in the papers, this original version is rather tame in that it mostly suggests possibilities and emphasizes how people are still trying to figure it all out. The writer doesn't come out and pronounce the skeleton a giant explicitly, but just hopes to conjure up that image without committing, saying that the person must have been of immense size and was possessed of the living strength of a giant, and that the local people believe there were giants. The writer actually is more interested in how old it is, suggesting it could be thousands of years old, and proposing that it could be a link in the evolutionary chain by saying this could be a missing link between man and the lower animals, that the skull looks almost gorilla-like, and in the title, that the bones predate Adam himself. But let's fast forward a few weeks and look at how there have been some further embellishments.
The skeleton of a giant found near Miamisburg is the cause of much discussion, not only among the curious and illiterate, but among the learned scientists of the world. The New York World tells the story of its discovery as follows.
So their source is the New York World. I tried to find the article they're quoting from, but couldn't.
The body of a man more gigantic than any ever recorded in human history has been found in the Miami Valley in Ohio. The skeleton, it is calculated, must have belonged to a man 8 feet and a half inch in height.
Okay, so now the story has grown somewhat.
It was found within a half-mile of Miamisburg, in a locality which contains many relics of the mound builders. Edward Gebhardt and Edward Kaufman discovered it while they were working in a gravel pit. Kaufman struck a hard substance with his pick, and examining it found it to be a skull. When they unearthed the whole skeleton, and finally realized its size, they were aghast. The skeleton is of prehistoric age, being fossilized.
As I understand it, fossilization generally takes at least 10,000 years. For context, the Miamisburg Mound belongs to the Adena culture, which existed around 2,000 years ago.
Its giant proportions present a puzzling problem to archaeologists.
Uh-oh, better watch out, archaeologists. Your timeline is all wrong.
The old theory of tradition that there were giants in the early days of the earth has long been discredited.
The writer is talking about the Nephilim of the Bible.
It is a fact generally agreed that prehistoric men were little, dark, monkey-like hairy creatures, considerably smaller than those of the present day.
The writer appears to be referring to the theory of biological evolution.
The prehistoric giant seems evidence of the opposite state of affairs. He is clearly a man, and a very well-formed and very well-proportioned one as to his limbs. His skull is of extremely low order, being but a shade higher than Pithecanthropus erectus found in Java. It is far below that of the most degraded living type. The prehistoric giant must have had a head not differing greatly from a gorilla. In stature, however, he was far bigger and also better formed.
Now, as I understand it, Homo sapiens are the only species of human ever to be found in America to this very day. I don't think the writer knows what he's talking about. The article repeats a story word for word the same as what was published in other papers, but then it adds this interesting part at the end.
Professor Thomas Wilson, curator of prehistoric anthropology at the Smithsonian Institute, says of the find, "The authenticity of the skull is beyond any doubt. Its antiquity is unquestionably great, though it is impossible to give a good guess as to its age. To my personal knowledge, several such crania were discovered in the Hopewell group of mounds in Ohio, exhibiting very monkey-like traits. The jaws were prognathous, projecting beyond the face, and the facial index remarkably low. With these remains we find thousands of objects, illustrating the extent of prehistoric commerce in this country. Shells from the southern coast, mica from Virginia, copper from Lake Superior, and volcanic glass from the Rock Mountains."
So here, Smithsonian Director of Prehistoric Anthropology Thomas Wilson is mentioned again. I could not verify this quote. Wilson did sometimes reference the Hopewell Mounds of Ohio in his published writing, but in connection with artifacts, not bones. As far as I could find, he never published anything about skulls with monkey-like traits. Cyrus Thomas's 1894 Bureau of Ethnology report had already been published by this time, and it includes careful descriptions of burials and crania from Ohio Hopewell sites. These are measured, tabulated, and identified as human, with no suggestion of monkey-like qualities. But maybe Wilson did say this? Why Wilson looked only at the skull and not the rest of the skeleton, I don't know. But because his comment is rather superficial, expressions such as "good guess" and "to my personal knowledge" suggest that Wilson did not perform any real analysis on the skull and is just giving his thoughts after a brief look. My guess is that maybe Wilson was at the mounds and the two men brought the skull to him, suggesting that it looked monkey-like, and Wilson made this comment. Or maybe he was asked by someone from the paper. Whatever the case, his words certainly do not confirm the existence of a giant, nor do they suggest that Wilson confiscated the skull. Stories about giant discoveries continue into the early 20th century, though they do begin to taper off. It's kind of interesting that the reports practically disappear by the time we get to World War II. Archaeology of Native American sites did not end then. They have continued until today, and new sites have been found. But the giant craze ended around the time that forensic anthropology made advances in scientific measurement of human remains. Ponder that. I ran into an interesting article about some hog farmers in Kansas who found Native American graves on their farm in 1936. And even as late as 1973, they still had the skeletons on display and were charging admission.
Hog farmers Howard and John Price operate a cemetery to augment their income. For 50 cents, they let outsiders take a tour of their graveyard. They have on display the skeletal remains of 146 men, women, and children. Our burial place is the 5th most popular tourist spot in the state of Kansas, said John Price, 75, with obvious pride. We're not getting rich on it. We make much more raising hogs. But we get 10,000 to 20,000 people coming through here each year, which ain't bad. John Price and his brother Howard, 73, have operated the graveyard as a public attraction since 1936, when the first of the graves on their hog ranch, 5 miles east of Salina, was discovered. Exhibited are the remains of a race of giant Indians believed to have lived in Kansas about 800 years ago. People enjoy coming here. It's a novelty, something different, said Price, as he brushed a mixture of alcohol and shellac on the remains of a child to preserve the tiny skeleton. I can recall only 2 or 3 people in the last 37 years who didn't think that it was worth 50 cents. The hog farmer admitted, however, that he had complaints from Indians in recent months. That bunch raising hell and wounded knee stopped by here last fall, said Price. They claimed that we were violating the rights of Indians by displaying the bones. They said the skeletons were only 150 years old. They asked how we'd like it if our relatives were dug up and Indians charged admission for people to come and see them. The Price brothers said they presented the Indians with documents from the Smithsonian Institution showing that carbon tests taken of the skeletons indicated the burials took place about 1200 A.D. The Price brothers insist that exposed skeletons shown exactly as they were found in digs by amateur archaeologists 37 years ago have educational value. We get many university professors and students from all over the Midwest, one said. Notice the way they were buried, their arms and legs folded up against their chest, he asked as we walked from one skeleton to another. The Indians waited several months after death and then buried their loved ones, folding up their bodies like when they were born. See how all the skeletons are buried north to south? Then look at the direction that the skulls are facing. Archaeologists tell us that if the head faced the rising sun, that person died in the morning. If his head faced the setting sun, then he died in the afternoon. Them on their backs, they died at night.
Nearly all the adult skeletons are of men and women, who would have been 6 to 7 feet in height.
Doubtful. On exhibit in the souvenir shop are pottery, ceremonial flint knives, necklaces made of shells, grinding stones, and other artifacts found in a village site near the cemetery. Billboards in the Salina area proclaim, "Largest prehistoric Indian burial in the Middle West, a must-see for every vacationer at the Price Brothers Farm." Chamber of Commerce brochures advise visitors in Salina not to miss the burial pit, one of the most important archaeological discoveries in the nation. The recent Indian objection to the exhibit did have one effect. A Lutheran church group canceled its annual convention in Salina. Lutheran leaders said they would boycott the city and not hold another convention there until the Indian cemetery on the hog ranch was closed to public visitation.
Now you might think, this is kind of tasteless, isn't it? To display Native American bodies like this? Some might even call it offensive. And indeed, over the years, Native American communities have complained about the treatment of their dead ancestors.
There was a law passed not too long ago which required all museums to return anything that was of value to Native American cultures back to the tribes, especially if it was funeral, anything that have to do like funeral, whatever it's called, death rites or whatever, to return all that stuff. So this law is passed, the museums have to do all that, but specifically it says in line after line, Smithsonian is exempt. Smithsonian doesn't count. Smithsonian doesn't have to do any of this, so they don't have to respond to any of it.
What AJ doesn't realize is that before the law he mentions was passed, it's called NAGPRA, and it was passed in 1990, the Smithsonian already created in 1989 its own National Museum of the American Indian Act.
If any Indian human remains are identified by a preponderance of the evidence as those of a particular individual or as those of an individual culturally affiliated with a particular Indian tribe, the Secretary, upon the request of the descendants of such individual or of the Indian tribe, shall expeditiously return such remains, together with any associated funerary objects, to the descendants or tribe as the case may be. If any Indian funerary object, not associated with Indian human remains, is identified by a preponderance of the evidence as having been removed from a specific burial site of an individual culturally affiliated with a particular Indian tribe, the Secretary, upon the request of the Indian tribe, shall expeditiously return such object to the tribe.
The Smithsonian's anthropology collections already operated and still do under repatriation law. and the 1990 passage of NAGPRA prompted the Smithsonian to establish its Repatriation Office in 1991. And since then, they have returned thousands of artifacts and skeletons that they have taken over the years back to the indigenous tribes who have asked for their return.
There's one giant story that's interesting because it overlaps several cultures, native cultures, where you've got in like the Mississippi Valley, they have these Indian myths about these giants they're cannibals. So they're eating the people, and they get driven west by the tribes. They unite and drive them west into like Nevada and California, and they end up at what's known as Lovelock Cave. And the Lovelock Cave giants are famous giants. They're the red-haired giants. So the story goes that they're at war with all these tribes, and during the war, when the natives are falling, they're like eating them in the battlefield. So it unites the tribes, and they drive them into Lovelock Cave, and they seal the cave, and they set fire to the whole place.
In the Great Basin, there are Paiute stories about a hostile people called the Si-Te-Cah, meaning tool eaters. Tool is a plant. These tales, first recorded ethnographically by Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins in Life Among the Paiutes, published in 1883, describe them as violent human enemies, not red-haired, not cannibals, they're tool eaters after all, and not giants. Those details appeared only in much later retellings. Other native groups in the Mississippi Valley have their own mythic giants, but there's no single continuous story linking them westward to Nevada. No pre-contact or early ethnographic source links Mississippi Valley giants with the Paiute Si-Te-Cah or with Lovelock Cave. All these disparate stories were stitched together in the 20th century by popular writers.
An archaeologist goes in there and finds sandals that are like size 29 and these giant clothes that, like, I'm not making this part up. You can go see this. Like, why is there a sandal that's this size that are all found in the cave, and bones and red hair? But, and all that stuff has been sent back, and then it's just gone.
Lovelock Cave is a real site in Nevada, excavated in 1912 by Llewellyn Loud of the University of California, and in 1924 by Loud and Mark Harrington of the American Museum of Natural History. The site yielded thousands of normal-sized artifacts, including human burials belonging to the Lovelock culture, a late phase of the northern Paiute ancestral sequence. The full excavation report is Loud and Harrington's Lovelock Cave, which is available online. It describes no oversized skeletons. What the excavators actually found were 87 specimens of sandals made of tool or rush, most of them fragmentary. Of the ones that it was possible to measure, the sandals of finer type measure about 25 centimeters, they say, which would come out to a men's size 9 in the U.S. Coarser type sandals they measured came out to between 25 and 28 centimeters, which would be sizes 9 to 10. The original measurements are in Loud and Harrington's tables and are perfectly ordinary. I don't know where the size 29 claim comes from, but it certainly isn't from the archaeological report. All human remains recovered from Lovelock Cave were standard adult sizes. They were sent to the University of California's Museum of Anthropology, now the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum in Berkeley, and are still cataloged there. They never disappeared. Some mummies and scalp fragments from Lovelock appear reddish today, because black hair often turns red or orange after long exposure to alkali soils. This is a well-documented chemical effect, not evidence of a red-haired race. The reason why people wanted to believe in a red-haired race is because they were seeking evidence of white people in prehistoric times. While we're addressing things A.J. Gentile has said, let's look at a video he made on the Smithsonian for his YouTube channel, The Y-Files. I just want to address assertions that he made so as to clear a few things up.
David Hatcher Childress is a French author who's published 200 books.
To avoid confusion, historical revisionist David Hatcher Childress is an American, born in France, who has authored about 25 books. But he has a publishing company that has produced many more works of fantastical archaeology and pseudoscience by other authors.
He often covers ancient mysteries. He believes the United States government is actively suppressing archaeological discoveries. He mentions that while the film Raiders of the Lost Ark is fiction, the final scene showing the warehouse is close to reality. That the Smithsonian, an independent federal agency, is hiding some of the most important discoveries made in the Americas. He says the cover-up began in 1881 with famous geologist John Wesley Powell. Powell appointed Cyrus Thomas the director of the Eastern Mound Division of the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology. When Thomas came to the Smithsonian, he believed there was a race of mound builders that were distinct from and arrived before the American Indians. This school of thought is called diffusionism, which says throughout history, there's been a widespread dispersion of culture and civilization, even across great distances. The Smithsonian took the opposite approach. It promoted isolationism, which says most civilizations are isolated from each other and have little contact, especially when separated by large bodies of water.
This framing, which the Y-Files appears to have taken directly from an article called Archaeological Cover-ups by Childress, is a gross misrepresentation of the facts, because it makes it appear as if the Smithsonian's claim that the mound builders were Native Americans was based on an ideology that they already held, something Childress calls isolationism. But the fact of the matter is, the conclusion that the mound builders were Native American was based on the simple fact that only Native American material remains were found at the mounds. Cyrus Thomas may indeed have once believed that a lost race had built the mounds, but the reason why he changed his mind, as he says so himself, is because the evidence led him to that conclusion. He writes,
"The director of the Bureau of Ethnology," referring to Powell, "was desirous, therefore, that this important question, the origin of the mounds, should, if possible, be definitely settled, as it is the pivot on which all the other problems must turn. By following the plan adopted and using proper care to note the facts ascertained, without bias, not only would the facts bearing on this important question be ascertained, but the data would be preserved for the use of archaeological students without prejudice to any theory." He writes that accuracy as to details and statements, without regard to their bearing on any special theory, has been considered the chief and all-important point to be kept constantly in view in all the operations of the division.
Anyone who has ever read this mammoth report would never come to the conclusion that Thomas was coerced into changing his mind by Powell or anyone else. The report concentrates solely on the material evidence. Thomas's conclusion?
The links directly connecting the Indians and mound builders are so numerous and well established that archaeologists are justified in accepting the theory that they are one and the same people.
It was held that the advanced and highly populated civilizations of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys were rare, and that they didn't have contact with other advanced cultures like the Aztecs, the Toltecs, or the Maya. But the Mississippi River runs from Canada all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. To say these cultures were isolated is like saying that people in the Black Sea had no contact with people in the Mediterranean. That's ridiculous.
AJ is again just repeating David Hatcher Childress here. This argument of personal incredulity is based on the assumption that the reason why the Smithsonian archaeologists did not believe the mound builders were in contact with Mesoamerican states is because they thought it was too far away, or that the mound builders believed in isolating themselves, or some such thing. But the reason for their conclusion is simple. Nothing was found near the mounds that suggested such contact, as Powell himself pointed out.
With regard to the mounds so widely scattered between the two oceans, it may also be said that mound-building tribes were known in the early history of discovery of this continent, and that the vestiges of art discovered do not excel in any respect the arts of the Indian tribes known to history. There is therefore no reason for us to search for an extraliminal origin through lost tribes for the arts discovered in the mounds of North America.
When ancient mounds of the American Midwest are examined, they show the existence of a complex culture, cities larger than those in Europe at the time.
I think he claims this in an attempt to show that the mound builders must have been influenced by city builders. But it's not true that American cities were larger than those in Europe at the time. Cahokia, the largest of the mound builder settlements, had a population between 10 and 20,000. That's big in a North American context, but to give you perspective, in the 13th century, the largest cities in Europe had populations ranging from about 100,000 to 200,000 people. And you don't need to know about cities to develop your own cities. If that were the case, the world never would have developed cities in the first place.
They also show burials of extremely tall people, sometimes 7 or 8 feet tall. When the Spiro mounds were excavated in the 1930s, 7 and 8 foot tall skeletons were found, at a time when the average height of a human male was about 5'6". those skeletons have been lost.
We already talked about this. The skeletons were never lost. They were mismeasured.
In 1892, stone coffins were discovered in Alabama by Frank Burns during a geological survey. The coffins were about 7.5 feet long, hollowed out by fire and metal chisels. The findings were sent to the Smithsonian.
AJ should have fact-checked this. The coffins found by Frank Burns were made of wood, not stone. We have Burns' own report.
They found 8 or 10 wooden coffins of black and white walnut, hollowed or cut out of the solid, after the fashion of the dugout canoe. The coffins were sent to the Smithsonian Institution, where they've been restored as far as possible, and are now exhibited in the Department of Prehistoric Anthropology. 8 have been restored, and there are in addition many parts of coffins. The coffins are about 7.5 feet long, 14 to 18 inches wide, 21 inches thick, and 6 or 7 inches deep. They have been hollowed out by fire, aided by stone or copper chisels or hatchets.
In 1984, this report was found by researcher Frederick J. Pohl. He asked the Smithsonian about this. They said, "We have not been able to find the specimens in our collections, though records show that they were received."
Well, how do you lose giant stone coffins?
That weighed several tons? I don't know.
And never underestimate the incompetence of the federal government.
8 years later, the Smithsonian said they found the coffins, but they were stored in a warehouse that was contaminated by asbestos, so nobody could go in there to see them.
If they were trying to hide these wooden coffins, they wouldn't have put them on exhibit back in the day. And has it ever dawned on you that maybe the length of the coffin isn't going to tell you how tall the occupant was? Standard coffins today are 7 feet long. I mean, look at the illustration Burns left us. Notice how thick the walls are on the top and bottom. It's the length of the hollowed out portion that would be more important. When it comes to evidence for giants, this comes up short.
During World War II, a crew was building an airship in Alaska. They excavated a mound that had gigantic human remains, skeletons twice or 3 times the size of a normal human. This report has been confirmed by multiple sources. The Smithsonian collected the findings, and that was the last anyone heard about it.
This story comes from David Hatcher Childress, too, who related a story that cryptozoologist Ivan T. Sanderson told on The Tonight Show in the 1960s. I found a video of his appearance on December 3rd, 1963, in which he talks about the abominable snowmen, but not about this particular case, which I assume was on the January 29th, 1964 episode, but I don't know. He appeared several times on the show. According to Childress, Sanderson related a curious story about a letter he received regarding an engineer who was stationed on the Aleutian island of Shemya during World War II. While building an airstrip, his crew bulldozed a group of hills and discovered under several sedimentary layers what appeared to be human remains. The Alaskan mound was in fact a graveyard of gigantic human remains consisting of crania and long leg bones. The crania measured from 22 to 24 inches from base to crown. Since an adult skull normally measures about 8 inches from back to front, such a large crania would imply an immense size for a normally proportioned human. Furthermore, every skull was said to have been neatly trepanned, a process of cutting a hole in the upper portion of the skull. In fact, the habit of flattening the skull of an infant and forcing it to grow in an elongated shape was a practice used by ancient Peruvians, the Mayas, and the Flathead Indians of Montana. Sanderson tried to gather further proof, eventually receiving a letter from another member of the unit who confirmed the report. The letters both indicated that the Smithsonian Institution had collected the remains, yet nothing else was heard. Sanderson seemed convinced that the Smithsonian Institution had received the bizarre relics, but wondered why they would not release the data. He asks, is it that these people cannot face rewriting all the textbooks? This appears to be a case of finding elongated skulls, not giant skeletons, as AJ claims, though Childress does refer to long leg bones. Sanderson was actually more interested in aliens than in giants, but whatever the case, if the story is true, that the Smithsonian collected them, then I expect they are still among the tens of thousands of human remains that they gathered over the years, or have been returned to the indigenous people. I wouldn't really call a lack of published data on these skulls a cover-up. And maybe they were published. We're not given a date for this occurrence, so that makes it difficult to look up.
There are stories like this from Alaska all the way down to Mexico City. An amazing discovery is made, the Smithsonian steps in, the story disappears.
The story doesn't disappear, it just becomes less interesting to the giant seekers.
The saying, skeletons in your closet, means you have secrets you don't want revealed. Secrets that, if discovered, would be embarrassing and possibly dangerous. In the case of the Smithsonian, skeletons in the closet could be taken literally, but the government literally has evidence that an advanced race was in North America long before the native tribes arrived, evidence they don't want revealed.
Based on the preceding evidence, I'll let you be the judge of that. Online, you will occasionally see assertions that the Smithsonian admitted to destroying thousands of giant human skeletons.
The Institute has admitted destroying thousands of giant human skeletons in the early 1900s. The U.S. Supreme Court has ordered the Smithsonian Institution to release classified documents dating back to the early 1900s, proving that the organization participated in a major historical cover-up of evidence, showing that giant human remains in the tens of thousands were found across America and destroyed at the behest of high-ranking officials to protect the prevailing chronology of human evolution that existed at the time.
This news story can be traced back to a 2014 article published by the satirical news website World News Daily Report, now defunct. It was a parody, but many credulous people fell for it, and some of the uninformed keep citing it as fact to this day. Did you know that an underground city containing ancient hieroglyphs was found in the Grand Canyon in 1909? And the Smithsonian is covering it up? At least that's the big story going around the internet. To understand this one, we need to get some context. So I hope you'll bear with me while I show you what was happening in American media at the time. Then I'll tell you about the Grand Canyon discovery. One of the strangest episodes of this type that the newspapers went gaga over began in Michigan in 1890, when a man named James Scotford claimed to have discovered ancient objects while digging post holes. What he showed the public were clay tablets and copper artifacts covered in mysterious symbols and scenes. Before long, Scotford and his partner, Daniel Soper, a disgraced Michigan Secretary of State, were finding dozens more. The finds were spectacular: stone tablets engraved with biblical-looking figures, copper knives inscribed with crosses, and tablets bearing what they insisted were ancient Oriental scripts. Local clergymen and amateur archaeologists held them as proof that old world peoples, Egyptians, Phoenicians, even Assyrians, had colonized North America. Over the next 2 decades, hundreds of such items surfaced, often in miraculous caches, always somehow with Scotford or Soper close at hand. Collectors and even some religious groups bought into the finds. The objects often depicted scenes straight out of the Bible, alongside crude copies of Egyptian motifs. For those already eager to see the Americas as part of an ancient biblical landscape, the Michigan relics looked like smoking guns. You may remember me telling you about this story in my Ancient Texts That Were Faked video. Yes, it was a big hoax. When professional archaeologists examined them, they were shown conclusively to be modern forgeries. You see, it was very easy in those days for fake stories to get into print, just as easy as it is for fake stories to get on the internet today. And you didn't even have to create fake artifacts to get the newspaper to print it either. All you had to do was say you found something, and you didn't even need to show anything for it. Mark Twain told the story of how he, as a young man, made up a story and printed it in a newspaper. In his essay, The Petrified Man, he writes,
"In the fall of 1862, in Nevada and California, the people got to running wild about extraordinary petrifactions and other natural marvels. One could scarcely pick up a paper without finding in it 1 or 2 glorified discoveries of this kind. The mania was becoming a little ridiculous. I was a brand new local editor in Virginia City, and I felt called upon to destroy this growing evil. We all have our benignant fatherly moods at one time or another, I suppose. I chose to kill the petrifaction mania with a very delicate satire. But maybe it was altogether too delicate, for nobody ever perceived the satire part of it at all."
His story involved the discovery of a petrified man, and in it, he left some clues that he was just pulling people's legs. He described the man as having been found making this gesture, but he didn't describe it well enough and no one got the joke. They believed it. Now let me introduce you to a man who loved making up fake stories like this. He made a career out of fooling American newspapers. Joseph Mulhattan was his name. He was a traveling hardware salesman in the late 1800s, but what he really loved was spinning yarns for the media to print as true. He wasn't like Scotford or Soper, who did it to make a fortune. He did these as pranks, but time and time again, the newspapers picked up his tall tales. One of Mulhatton's favorite tricks was the fake cave discovery. He would describe caverns filled with treasure, mysterious inscriptions, or mummies. Newspapers across the country picked these up, often without even questioning them. And why would they? People ate these stories up. His pranks were legendary enough that the New York Times once dubbed him the Great Liar. His 1878 Grand Crystal Cave tale described a 23-mile cavern in Kentucky.
Another wonderful cave has recently been discovered near this town. It has already been explored for a distance of 23 miles in one direction, called the long route, and 16 miles in another direction, called the short route. The avenues are very wide. A span of horses can easily be driven through for a distance of 11 miles. 3 rivers, wide and very deep, are encountered on the long route. One of them is navigable for 14 miles, until the passages become too narrow to admit a boat. This forms the third, or river route, which has to be explored in a boat. This cave is wonderful beyond description, and far surpasses in grandeur the Mammoth, or any other cave ever before discovered. Several mummified remains have been discovered in one of the large rooms. They are reposing in stone coffins, rudely constructed, and from appearances they have been in this cave for centuries. They present every appearance of the Egyptian mummies. Great excitement prevails over this very important discovery. Mr. Edwin Mortimer of Chestnut Street, Louisville, Kentucky, purchased 3 of the mummies and has them now in his possession. Major George M. Proctor of Glasgow Junction, Kentucky, purchased the remainder of the mummies from the owner of the cave, whose name is Thomas Kelly. He is, or rather was a few days ago, a very poor man, struggling to make a payment on a farm of 24 acres, upon which, by mere accident, the entrance of this wonderful cave was discovered. He realized about $400 from the sale of the mummies, and has now offered $10,000 cash for the cave. The entrance to the cave is within the town limits, and is only about 2 minutes' walk from the depot, which makes it very valuable indeed, as visitors will not be compelled to travel 5 miles in a stagecoach, as they do if desirous of visiting Mammoth Cave, which is 5 miles from the town. In fact, all the celebrated caves of Kentucky are located in this immediate vicinity. The surface is very much broken, full of great elevations and depressions, with everything to indicate that there were volcanic eruptions or violent upheavals of the earth at some period. This is truly a wonderful portion of the continent. The newly discovered cave has been named the Grand Crystal Cave, and it is as beautiful as the name implies. Ladders and bridges are being constructed, and Mr. J.R. Puckett, a capitalist of the town, announces his intention of having a small steamboat constructed expressly for the purpose of navigating its wonderful rivers. Truly, this is a wonderful age. When will wonder cease?
Mulhatton's stories were known for being very detailed, which made them more believable. George Proctor, who was named in the story, wrote in to the paper to say that he didn't know why his name was being played upon in the article and that he did not buy any mummies. He suggested that the writer may have been reading recitations and imagining himself in the spirit land, or been under the influences of some of the mediums of the present day. He quotes Thomas Kelly, the owner of the cave, who says that yes, he owns a cave, but it is nothing like described in the article. J.R. Puckett wrote in to make fun of the whole story, saying that, yes, such a cave existed in his dreams of the year AD 1996. Despite the debunkings, newspapers around the country continued to print the story, completely unaware. Mulhatton kept the story alive and even got it printed the following year in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, which included a number of further embellishments and even illustrations of the non-existent mummies.
Owing to obstructions in the shape of huge rocks, the cave was explored but a short distance until June 1878, when Mr. J.R. Puckett and a few other daring explorers penetrated its mysteries by crawling several hundred yards between fallen rocks and then emerging in an avenue at least 60 feet wide. Following it for about a mile, they discovered an immense room, in dimensions about 100 yards in width by about 100 feet in height, and tapering out in length into an avenue, a continuation of the one they had been traversing. The beauties of this chamber are simply indescribable. It is called the Crystal Chamber and is well named. The most beautiful and fantastic formations imaginable are here to be seen, all in clusters of crystal. At a distance of about 3 miles, in a very picturesque spot, 6 mummies were found on a ledge of rocks. They were reposing in stone coffins rudely constructed and presented every appearance of the Egyptian mummies. 3 of the mummies were male and 3 of them female. Mr. W. Edwin Mortimer, who resides at number 299 Floyd Street, Louisville, Kentucky, purchased 2 of them. Mr. J.R. Puckett, a capitalist of Glasgow Junction, purchased 2, and Joseph Mulhatton the remaining 2.
Our illustrations are furnished by the latter gentleman. So in this context, the story that I'm about to tell you regarding the Grand Canyon will make a lot more sense. By that time, a claim that hieroglyphs were found in a Grand Canyon cave would be believed by many people without question. The American public had already been primed by 2 decades. That's why Egyptian writing had become a stock ingredient in media hoaxes. Heck, Manhattan even got people to believe that the corpse of George Washington had been petrified and that they were talking about putting it on display at the Centennial in 1875. In 1883, he even bragged about his famous hoaxes in an interview. After that, he continued fooling the newspapers, even convincing them that another moon of the Earth had been discovered. Anyway, here's the story that David Hatcher Childress has made much of in recent years. On April 5, 1909, the Arizona Gazette, a Phoenix newspaper, ran a front-page story telling of a Smithsonian-backed expedition led by one Professor S.A. Jordan after an underground city in the Grand Canyon had been discovered by an explorer named G.E. Kincaid. The Gazette cites Kincaid as their source.
According to the story related to the Gazette by Mr. Kincaid, the archaeologists of the Smithsonian Institute, which is financing the expeditions, have made discoveries which almost conclusively prove that the race which inhabited this mysterious cavern, hewn in solid rock by human hands, was of Oriental origin, possibly from Egypt, tracing back to Ramses. If their theories are borne out by the translation of the tablets engraved with hieroglyphics, the mystery of the prehistoric peoples of North America, their ancient arts, who they were, and whence they came, will be solved. Egypt and the Nile, and Arizona and the Colorado will be linked by a historical chain running back to ages which staggers the wildest fancy of the fictionist. Under the direction of Professor S.A. Jordan, the Smithsonian Institute is now prosecuting the most thorough explorations, which will be continued until the last link in the chain is forged.
But Kincaid was quick to add that nobody can actually go observe the excavations because they are sealed off from the public because the scientists wish to work unmolested. So, you can't verify his story in any way. Don't even try. You just have to take his word for it. Kincaid describes his initial discovery this way.
I was journeying down the Colorado River in a boat, alone, looking for mineral. Some 42 miles up the river from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon, I saw on the east wall stains in the sedimentary formation about 2,000 feet above the riverbed. There was no trail to this point, but I finally reached it with great difficulty. Above a shelf, which hid it from view from the river, was the mouth of the cave. There are steps leading from this entrance some 30 yards to what was, at the time the cavern was inhabited, the level of the river. When I saw the chisel marks on the wall inside the entrance, I became interested, securing my gun, and went in. During that trip, I went back several hundred feet along the main passage till I came to the crypt, in which I discovered the mummies. One of these I stood up and photographed by flashlight. I gathered a number of relics, which I carried down the Colorado to Yuma, from whence I shipped them to Washington, with details of the discovery. Following this, the explorations were undertaken. Upwards of 50,000 people could have lived in the caverns comfortably. One theory is that the present Indian tribes found in Arizona are descendants of the serfs or slaves of the people which inhabited the cave. Undoubtedly, a good many thousands of years before the Christian era, a people lived here which reached a high stage of civilization.
It's a thrilling story, but did it happen? Up in Flagstaff, the Coconino Sun laughed it off.
The reported discovery of a mammoth underground city of an ancient race in the Grand Canyon seems to be a splendid piece of imagination sent out by some Manhattanized individual. At least one in this section of Arizona knows anything of it, and it would be just possible that someone at the Grand Canyon would have been informed of it, if an actual discovery had been made. The man who wrote up the find certainly had to dig some for the details and was wise in locating the entrance at a point on a sheer wall where no one but a person with a great imagination could reach it.
In other words, even some people in 1909 knew a cave hoax when they saw one. And there is an uncanny resemblance to Manhattan's repertoire. A cavern with endless halls and mysterious inscriptions, treasure hoards and outlandish claims of vanished civilizations. Seriously, the claims are extravagant. An idol resembling the Buddha holding the lotus flower? The Old World lotus, used in Buddhism, is not native to America. Copper instruments as hard as steel? A crypt with mummies, a chamber with deadly gas, a cavern so large that 50,000 people could live inside it comfortably? And the Coconino Sun is right. If an excavation was going on there, someone would have seen something. No one bumped into the archaeologists going to and from the site. They didn't stay at any lodging places nearby. Moreover, there are indications that the article was meant to be satirical, because there are some jokes in it, as if the writers are winking at you. Kincaid is quoted as saying the site is some 42 miles up the river from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon. There was and is no such place. There is an El Tovar hotel, but it is 3 miles south of the river that Kincaid was traversing. It's the only thing that was called El Tovar there. So the name for this place was likely inspired by the El Tovar Hotel, which had only just been built 4 years earlier. There is no record of a G.E. Kincaid being born in Idaho, which is where the paper insists he's from. I checked myself. And no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan. As far as we can tell, these people never existed. The latter character may have been based on David Starr Jordan, president of Stanford University, who had been affiliated with the Smithsonian. Even the Gazette's layout nodded to the joke. Right beside the story was a large ad headlined Orange Blossoms. Orange Blossom is a pseudonym Mulhattan often used in his hoaxes. There was a prelude to this story in the same paper a few weeks prior. G.E. Kincaid of Lewiston, Idaho, arrived in Yuma after a trip from Green River, Wyoming, down the entire course of the Colorado River. He is the second man to make this journey and came alone in a small skiff, stopping at his pleasure to investigate the surrounding country. He left Green River in October, having a small covered boat with oars and carrying a fine camera with which he secured over 700 views of the river and canyons, which were unsurpassed. Mr. Kincaid says one of the most interesting features of the trip was passing through the sluiceways at Laguna Dam. He made this perilous passage with only the loss of an oar. Some interesting archaeological discoveries were unearthed, and altogether the trip was of such interest that he will repeat it next winter in the company of friends. This is where the newspaper introduced its readership to the G.E. Kincaid character, but note that the surname is spelled with a C instead of a K. The article says he brought a fine camera on the trip and took over 700 photos. In the longer article, he says he took photos inside the cavern. Where are the photos? What better proof could there be than Kincaid's photos? If he could go to the paper with the story, surely he could bring the photos with him to prove the truth of his story. Hey, how about a photo of Kincaid himself with his boat? We don't even get that. When the article says he is the second man to make this journey, it's probably referring to an expedition made the year before, and for which we do have some photos, that of Charles Russell and E.R. Monette, who made a 752-mile trip from Green River, Utah, to the Grand Canyon between September 1907 and February 1908. This expedition was talked about in many papers. Note how Kincaid is said to have started his similar expedition in Green River, Wyoming, instead of Green River, Utah, which would make his trip even longer, and thus topping the former record. And his trip was exactly 1 year later, lasting from October to March instead of September to February. And whereas Russell and Monette are said to have lost one of their boats, the paper wants you to know that Kincaid lost only one of his oars. This appears to be an inside joke. Even more obvious as to the satirical nature of this article is that it reports that one of the most interesting features of the trip for Kincaid was passing through the sluiceways at Laguna Dam. The construction of the dam had just been completed in 1909. Boats cannot go through the Laguna Dam, as it was designed specifically to stop boat travel on the river. This looks like another inside joke. Why would the Gazette run such pieces? Well, this was a paper that was known for its tabloid-style sensationalism. Gazette readers saw headlines about murders and suicides and crazy people and freak accidents from around the world. If such a discovery had been real, you'd expect a media frenzy, but the Gazette story was almost totally ignored by other Arizona newspapers. Only one, as far as we can tell, reprinted the story. For most of the 20th century, the story was forgotten. Then in the 1970s and 80s, David Hatcher Childress revived it.
Jerry Wills and his wife Kathy have been studying the Kincaid Cave mystery for years. Their approach was find the original base camp of the explorers, which would lead them to the cave. After years of research and exploring the area where G.E. Kincaid said he found the cave, Jerry and Kathy found a location covered in artifacts from that time. And on the canyon wall just below this area, they believe is the entrance to the underground city. Exploring is difficult though. The entire area where the cave is supposed to be is designated off-limits by the federal government.
After fact-checking this, I discovered that AJ is wrong on 2 counts. First, the location that Jerry and Kathy Wills think the cave is not the area where G.E. Kincaid says he found it. Second, neither area is designated off-limits by the federal government. Regarding that first point, G.E. Kincaid says in the paper that the cavern was some 42 miles up the river from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon. We already discussed how there's no such place, but if A.J. is claiming that Jerry Wills went to the area where G.E. Kincaid indicated, then he would have to be going by this direction. For the sake of illustration, let's say that El Tovar Crystal Canyon is meant to be the area near the El Tovar Hotel, the only thing called El Tovar in the Grand Canyon. If we go 42 miles upriver, this is the area we get to. And this is what it looks like on the river. This is an area in which there are hiking trails and where people are allowed to freely move around. It's not off limits. And after all these years of people moving to and fro over this area, no cavern entrance has ever been found. Where does Jerry Wills think the cavern entrance is? Let's get the testimony from Jerry himself. He was featured in an episode of America Unearthed, starring Scott Walter, and we will look at some of that, but he goes into more depth in an interview he gave on the Unity Manifest podcast. So let's hear how he came to figure out where the cave was. It turns out it wasn't from G.E. Kincaid.
We got together with some friends that were as interested as we were, and we started taking a look at all of the information. One of the things that we were going by was this article in, what was the Arizona Gazette, I think, that talked about Kincaid and, all that stuff. Well, it referenced an article prior to the one that we had, but no one had ever found that article, ever. And so most people figured it was just, a mistype, or they misspoke, or who knows what.
Jerry's memory must be faulty, as the Arizona Gazette references no prior article.
But no one could ever find the prior article until Kathy came along, and she started doing some very deep research, which is what she does. And we found that there was a copy of the Arizona Gazette in a private collection in Yuma, and it had the prior story. So we got a copy of that, and we published that.
So apparently, in a private collection, someone had both a copy of the Arizona Gazette article and a copy of this other article, which he calls the prior article. And this meant to Jerry and Kathy that they must go together naturally, not just because someone chose to put both in their collection.
And I don't remember what the prior story said. I haven't looked at that in a decade. But from that, we were able to determine that wherever this might have been, it would definitely have to be where the Little Colorado merged into the Colorado River. And from that fork forward, at some point, and not very far, this is where that cave would be found.
So this is where Jerry thinks the cave entrance is. And this is where Kincaid apparently places it. These are quite a distance apart.
We also, with Kathy's help, of course, she looked into Wesley Powell's information, everything about him, what he did, where he was, all the details. And then we looked into this fellow Kincaid and found out everything about him that there was to find. He was like one of the firstborn sons in Idaho. For example, his father was a Mason. Kincaid actually found what they called an Egyptian egg. I don't know what it was, but it was a large egg that had been just, carved out like you see in the Orient. So they got Powell charged Kincaid to go back and look into this.
There are only two sources on G.E. Kincaid, the two Arizona Gazette articles. That's it. In neither of them does it say his father was a Mason or that he found an Egyptian egg. We also have no record of contact between Kincaid and John Wesley Powell, the director of the United States Geological Survey at the Smithsonian, who died in 1902, by the way, 7 years before G.E. Kincaid is ever mentioned anywhere.
But one of the things that happened that everyone misses is that there were these two brothers who were up there in that area. They were hunting and prospecting.
Jerry is now referring to that prior article he was talking about. This is the article that he uses to find the location of Kincaid's cave. It comes from the Salt Lake City Mining Review, a paper for miners, the issue of January 15, 1903. But he's already messed up the story. It wasn't two brothers. According to the article, they were second or third cousins. Mike Smith, a younger guy, and Jake Johnson, an older guy. The story appears to be from Mike Smith's point of view, but there's no author listed, so it may be the editor, Will C. Higgins, who wrote it.
There was, at one point, this sounds cliche, but the daughter of a chief of the Paiute tribe that was about to be mauled by a mountain lion. And these guys were hunters. They killed it. The chief was very grateful, but he wasn't very happy that they were on his property either. So instead of killing them, he said, look, we really appreciate what you did. I'm paraphrasing. We really appreciate what you did. And since you're looking for gold, we're going to give you all the gold you can carry, but you never come back. They said, okay. So they were taken to this place out in the desert near the Grand Canyon. And there was a cave that was full of all kinds of gold and gold objects. The brothers took all they could carry on their animals, and they were told to leave and never come back. So they left. They went from there up to Salt Lake City, which was the nearest city for them to go to and dispose of this gold.
He's really mangling the story, but I realize he's going from memory. The Paiute man was not a chief, and he never threatened to kill anybody. His name was Rabbit Tail, and he rescued Jake, who had fallen from a cliff, and nursed him back to health. It was only Jake who was there and who saved Rabbit Tail's wife, not daughter, from the mountain lion. Mike was not yet part of the story. Rabbit Tail told Jake that he knew where there was an old gold mine, and that if he came back in a year, he would show it to him. Jake showed up with Mike a year later. Rabbit Tail took him to the gold mine, blindfolding them on the path, so they couldn't come back later and find it. Now please note that Rabbit Tail describes this place explicitly as a mine. Even the title refers to it as an old Spanish mine. Here's what they saw.
The sight that met their gaze in this chamber rendered the two prospectors speechless. Under the glare of torches, bottom, sides, and top were resplendent with bright, glittering gold. In front was a great body of honeycombed quartz, in which were nuggets of the pure metal as large as walnuts. These were bound to the quartz by wire gold. The roof of the stope presented a perfect fretwork of wire and native gold, which seemed to be woven into festoons. On the sides, the gold occurred in hard white quartz, such as beautiful jewelry is made from. On the floor, great chunks of the gold-bearing ore were laying around, and among them were to be seen mining tools of ancient make, while in one corner could dimly be discerned the skeleton of a man, evidently that of a white miner.
This is very different from the cave described in Kincaid's story. This is natural gold. There's no mention of any artifacts here, or hieroglyphs, or statues, nor an underground city. I should add that we're told in the story that all this occurred many years ago, but that Mike was still alive and was now the owner of a very successful company. He and Jake had tried to find the mine again and again after that occasion, but never were able to. They tried for many years.
The backstory, or the meanwhile that's taking place, is that Powell knows that there's something going on out there. And he knows there's lost cities, there's riches, there's all kind, who knows what. So consequently, all the places that would receive gold, they were looking for any kind of gold artifacts. And if they found something, Washington wanted to know about it. Powell was now the Secretary of the Interior. So the brothers show up in Salt Lake City. Here's all these gold things. They trade it in. They get their money. Washington's notified. And Powell says, get a hold of Kincaid because he's a famous mountaineer, rough guy explorer. Send him down the river and give him my notes on what I found. Kincaid gets involved. He goes down the river.
Notice how he speaks with such authority about what happened, and yet all of this is completely made up. It does not appear in any accounts from the time. It's just invented. He could have said, well, I infer this, or I'm putting two and two together. But no, he just states it as if it were historical fact. Considering that there is a long space of time between the mine story and Kincaid's story, this narrative seems highly unlikely.
So with all of these details in hand, we know now within a very short range, really, where this is at. So using Google Earth, we start plotting out exactly where we're going to have our base camp and where this cave might be.
The article about the Spanish mine places Rabbit Tail's home in the Grand Canyon of the Colorado near the Utah-Arizona line. The story says that Rabbit Tail, Jake, and Mike hiked through very rough terrain, lots of rocks and boulders, and they made it to the mine and back between dawn and dusk of a single day. So it's not described as being far. There's nothing said about the mine being in the canyon of the river itself. In fact, it says that large trees grew over the top of it. Now, of course, prospector stories are a lot like fishing stories. When one reads this tale about a lost mine with fabulous gold in a mining newspaper, especially in this style, we ought to be somewhat suspicious of its veracity. But even if it were true, it has nothing to do with Kincaid or his underground city. So why does Jerry use this story to locate Kincaid's cave? It makes no sense.
Now this place is very dangerous.
Why do you say that?
Well, it's dangerous because while we were there on several occasions, there were government stealth helicopters.
Stealth helicopters? Seriously?
They know it's there, Scott, and we know that they know it's there.
So, do you think they were trying to scare you off?
I know they were trying to scare us off. While our team was going down, descending into the canyon over these cliffs, you can see very clearly.
Holy crap.
There's this unmarked plane that's flying well below the canyon rim. As you see it going right through there. We've also seen helicopters, and they've buzzed us at various times we've been there. They don't have any markings either, and we feel they must be government helicopters, government airplanes.
The canyon has FAA-designated flight-free zones and corridors with minimum altitudes, yes. But there's not a blanket ban below the rim. Aircraft do operate within the canyon airspace under special flight rules. For example, in the Dragon and Zuni Point corridors.
So, Jerry, this was your base camp right here, right? This is where you started your operation to get down to what you hoped was the Egyptian cave?
This is it.
This is nowhere near where Kincaid indicated. But the fact that they took a helicopter here shows this is not a no-fly zone. Interesting that no stealth planes showed up this time to see what they're up to.
Going over the side, it just seems impossible. You can't see the cave from the bottom, nor can you see it from the top. It's at an in-between level. It's completely obscured.
If it's impossible to physically reach it now, would it have been more possible for Kincaid to have done it by himself in 1909? Jerry claims that there probably were Moki steps there in Kincaid's time, but Kincaid says there was no trail to this point. The only time he mentions steps is when he says there were steps leading down into the cavern from the entrance. So after considering all of this, I can see that the claim that the Smithsonian covered up Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon involves a great deal of credulity and imagination. It starts with a single 1909 article, which is patterned on known hoaxes of the time, and in which none of the characters in it can be corroborated, and is built on the idea of forbidden zones, none of which line up with the article. To make it work, people have to stitch together disparate stories that do not naturally go together and rely heavily on speculation, innuendo, and arguments from silence. For those reasons, I just can't buy into it. David Hatcher Childress writes, "Is the idea that ancient Egyptians came to the Arizona area in the ancient past so objectionable and preposterous that it must be covered up? Perhaps the Smithsonian Institution is more interested in maintaining the status quo than rocking the boat with astonishing new discoveries that overturn previously accepted academic teachings." The history of the Smithsonian Institution shows a long track record of doing the opposite of what Childress says. Anyone who knows anything about the Smithsonian knows that it regularly revises its presentations, exhibits, and publications to reflect new archaeological findings, new scholarly research, and evolving historical interpretations, particularly regarding the history of the Americas. This demonstrates a commitment to evidence-based updates, rocking the boat, rather than maintaining the status quo. Let me give you a few examples to illustrate. In the 1840s, Smithsonian publications suggested that the elaborate earthworks of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, Cahokia, Serpent Mound, were built by a lost non-native mound builder race, implying Native Americans lacked the sophistication to construct them. By the 1880s to 1890s, after more comprehensive research, the Smithsonian changed its mind, conclusively attributing the mounds to Native American cultures like the Hopewell and Mississippian. This was a reversal. Early Smithsonian reports, for example 1870s surveys, described the Anasazi of the Southwest as a primitive nomadic people, with cliff dwellings like Mesa Verde seen as defensive hideouts. But in the 1920s and 30s, Smithsonian-affiliated archaeologists excavated Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, revealing sophisticated urban centers with trade networks reaching Mesoamerica. By the 1930s, Smithsonian exhibits in the Natural History Museum updated to highlight ancestral Puebloan urbanism, moving away from the old thinking. Pre-1920s, Smithsonian consensus held that human presence in the Americas was relatively recent, 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, based on limited archaeological evidence and biblical chronologies influencing early scholarship. The 1926 discovery of Folsom Points in New Mexico, followed by Clovis Points in the 1930s, prompted Smithsonian researchers to excavate and date sites, pushing human occupation back to at least 10,000 to 13,000 years ago. This revolutionized the Smithsonian's understanding of early human migration, correcting earlier publications and laying the groundwork for later Bering Land Bridge theories. Then, for decades, the consensus held that humans first arrived in the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge around 13,000 to 15,000 years ago, with the Clovis culture as the earliest widespread evidence, but work through the 1980s and 1990s began to change that, and in 2023, Smithsonian paleoanthropologists reanalyzed bones from Brazil's Santa Helena rock shelter, dating modified giant ground sloth bones used as pendants to 25,000 to 27,000 years ago. This pushed human presence in South America back by over 10,000 years, suggesting coastal or earlier migrations predating the last glacial maximum. This challenged the Clovis first model long taught in Smithsonian publications and prompted updates to educational materials. And there are numerous other examples which all illustrate how the Smithsonian routinely incorporates new evidence through digs, reanalysis of collections, and interdisciplinary work to refine its storytelling. Far from protecting a static narrative, the institution's 21 museums and research centers have updated thousands of exhibits and publications over decades. They contradict their earlier conclusions on a regular basis.
This is when evolution, this is when something called manifest destiny was happening. This is when a whole new paradigm of thinking in science was happening. And Smithsonian were really at the heart of it, and it influenced the whole world. But one of the things they wanted, as all the Westerners, so all the Europeans and other cultures moved into America, was to take the land and to take the areas and to move these so-called savages off the land, put them in reservations and things like this. And so their agenda of manifest destiny was all about that, and it was a big thing. And they were all into eugenics, they were kind of Nazis, racists, and these were the people running the high-level institutions of America.
I guess Hugh is saying here that you can't trust the Smithsonian because they were a bunch of racists and wanted to take over the continent. But what he fails to understand is that the idea of a lost race of giants who built the mounds was the propaganda that facilitated such intentions. When the Smithsonian finally let all that go and showed how the indigenous people were actually the ones to be credited for the artifacts and structures, they were undermining the argument that North America belonged to white people. Well, I think we've covered all the main arguments. We've looked at two of the Smithsonian's most persistent so-called cover-ups. First the giants and then the Grand Canyon underground city. And the real story, the one we can actually trace in the archives, is about how hoaxes are born, how rumors spread, and how legends get recycled. The Smithsonian isn't suppressing amazing discoveries, it's being used as a prop. Mythmakers like to use people's general distrust of government and institutions to bolster their speculative claims. If they can make you think that someone powerful doesn't want you to know something, then they've hooked you. That's how clickbait works. So the next time you hear that the Smithsonian covered up a shocking discovery, remember the words of the Coconino Sun back in 1909. A splendid piece of imagination.
You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word. So feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.